Welcome everyone to the James Smith Noel Collection, a virtual version of it. As you know, one of the effects of COVID-19 pandemic was the cancellation of all scheduled public events at the Noel Collection. Travel restrictions, the social distancing, all of these requirements have made in-person meetings impossible, and so unfortunately everything we've planned for you this fall had to be postponed. So one of the ways we've tried to work around it is to create this new series, which we tentatively call Reader Meet Author series, as an alternative for the in-person meetings that we used to have, as a way to bring exciting research, great authors to the general public. And today I'm very honored to welcome our first guest, Dr. Suzanne Marchand, who is actually a fellow Louisianian. She is the professor of history at Louisiana State University at Baton Rouge, an accomplished historian who's studied history at Berkeley, University of Chicago, where she finished her PhD. And she actually published a remarkable book earlier this year on the history of porcelain. So without further ado, welcome, Dr. Marchand.
Thank you, Alex. So great to be here. So nice to speak to your listeners.
Well, let me ask you this. I've been reading your book, and I got so excited about it that I reached out to you asking if you might share some of reasoning why you got into the research area that is about social dimension of porcelain. So what make you interested in this topic?
It's a very good question because my usual work is in intellectual history, the history of ideas. And so this was a departure for me to really move into the world of economic history, since this is in many ways a history of business and a history of an industry, and also the history of the decorative arts, which is something I've been interested in for a long time as a very, very ardent museum goer. I've been to many, many small museums, especially in Central Europe, and those of you who've also been to those museums know they are chock full of porcelain. And so for years I've wondered how that all got there, why people saved it, why it was made in so many different types and forms, and what it might say about the more general culture of Central Europe. Central European history is generally put into a very serious frame. People think the questions we need to ask about it have to do with high politics. They must deal with coal and steel and iron and wars. All of that is absolutely true. And of course, the 20th century has shown us that those things are crucial for our understanding. But we also have a great deal to learn about the consumer and business history of this part of the world, which is not the same as Western Europe in many respects. And its industrial revolution and consumer revolutions are different in shape, and they have different kinds of foci and different kinds of origins. So I discovered that by looking at the porcelain industry, I could branch into a new area of Central European history that hasn't been much touched, particularly by historians. Now, of course, museum curators and collectors and art historians know a great deal about this world as concerns the most important artistic pieces. And I've learned immense amounts from them. That they've been my greatest interlocutors and informants. But I wanted to do something a bit different, and that was to really track the history of this industry and to use it in a way as a sort of proxy for the history of German economic history, which can sound very boring, but which is in fact so important and so interesting. If you look at Germany today, of course, it's one of the most important world economic powers. So how did that happen, and what kinds of specialties led to that?
Well, let me ask you this, because the book is not just about economics, but it's also, to me, it's a human story, and it's a fascinating story because we know that Chinese developed porcelain. They were famous for their ceramics, and in fact, they dominated this porcelain production for many a year, I mean, for centuries. And then you describe in your book that Europeans for quite a while tried to replicate it, unsuccessfully so, until these experimenters employed by Augustus the Strong, this remarkable ruler of Saxony, really hit the pay dirt. And you especially focus on the travails of one particular experimenter, the alchemist, or however you want to call it. Can you elaborate on this serendipitous kind of discovery that they made?
Absolutely. One of the things I learned a great deal about in the course of writing this book was the history of invention. And it's more crazy and fun and interesting than we usually present it. And this is a great case of that. The person who did manage to replicate the Chinese recipe, which, as Alex says, absolutely was desired by Europeans, but not really replicated until 1708. He was a young apprentice of an apothecary in Prussia. He made the boast that he could make gold as an apprentice. And
what a boast.
He had to run away very fast because the King of Prussia wanted him to make gold if he possibly could to fund his armies. And he fell then into the arms of Augustus the Strong, who also wanted him to make gold. But as he couldn't make gold, he ended up making the second best thing as far as Augustus was concerned, and that is white, very translucent and beautiful porcelain. And that's how the first of the European manufactories of hard paste porcelain, a very specific type, the highest quality of porcelain, started to be made in Europe.
Now, this is the story of Johann Friedrich Beuttger, but I think you also touch in the book that he was assisted by a rather famed mathematician, right, Ehrenfried Walther von Tischenhaus. What did Augustus do with it? I mean, they stumble upon this recipe of what kaolin and clay and alabaster being mixed in specific proportions. But can you tell us what Augustus did with this with his discovery?
Well, I think stumbled on is not quite the word we need, Alex, because they spent a long time trying to figure it out. And it took a lot of capital for this to be realized. This is one reason why it had to be in Saxony that this was discovered, or in some other very rich state, because Augustus shelled out a lot of money to support the inventors while they were working. And you're quite right, it was not Butcher by himself. Tschirnhaus was crucial in advising him, and there were other courtier scientists who also helped. So it was by no means only Butcher who single-handedly invented porcelain. And then one needed what has been called, for the Industrial Revolution, a cascade of inventions to really perfect it. Because the first invention worked, but you couldn't glaze it very easily. It was also extremely expensive in terms of its contents, and it was a secret recipe. So it was protected by not just the manufacturer, but by the actual craftsman who made it. And that created all kinds of industrial espionage. So it was a very strange and wild world of invention that
which you explore to a certain degree by noting that despite the best efforts of Augustus the Strong, the secret formula was quickly or this arcanum, right, was quickly discovered. Yes. And this hope that Augustus had to have a monopoly on porcelain works, and he, to a certain degree, had by establishing the right factory at Mason, that kind of vision disappeared. But can you elaborate on this porcelain making that so quickly spread in Europe?
So one of the ways it spread is so familiar to us today. So disgruntled employees who thought they weren't paid enough were bribed away by another corporation, in this case, another prince. Or they were tricked into divulging their secrets, or their daughters seduced, or they were just simply burgled. So the recipe could be stolen in any number of ways, and many princes wanted to have their own porcelain manufactories after they saw Augustus' success with Meissen. And so very quickly by the 1750s, you find manufactories all over the German states, I'd say 30 by that time. And then you also have imitators outside. The French, of course, want to have their own at Sèvres, and many others follow as well. But it's still a secret until the abolition of secrets officially in 1810. So it takes a long time for the full recipe to be known and to be divulged.
One of the aspects of your writing that I really find very interesting is that you point out in the book that porcelain usually associated with, as an industry, with, this burgeoning kind of profit making. But the reality was that many rulers who sponsored it, as you point out in the book, didn't really care for money making side of the business or the industry, but rather they looked at it as a really symbol of their status, luxury, maybe intellectual sophistication and the grandeur. And I think in one of the passages of the book, you say that by end of 1750s, that porcelain, you write, was a, quote, necessary aspect of splendor and prestige. Can you elaborate on this?
Certainly. One of the things that was surprising to me to figure out was that really for quite a long time, people didn't want porcelain just to hold hot drinks, like the porcelain mug I'm using now. It was to put on the walls, to display to your friends, to show that you were refined, perhaps to use for dessert dishes. But for the most part, it was for show, not for utility. And that was something that princes, especially as they got a little richer in the 18th century, wanted to own for themselves in each of those little princedoms. So the Holy Roman Empire at the time had 330 some states. So you can multiply that and see how many princes wanted to show their refinement and their elegance.
Well, one of my favorite moments in the book that you mentioned, one of my favorite is Frederick the Great, because he is one of these German rulers and he desperately wants to have his hands on Arcanum, on this recipe. He wants his own wall of porcelain. And I think you talk about this staggering 30,000 trials or so, right, that his chemists tried unsuccessfully to produce. So unsuccessfully to reproduce this porcelain. So Frederick did the next best thing. He simply occupied Meissen and commandeered the whole factory.
Right. Let's just take it and conquer it if we can't make it, for sure. And the other thing that I realized in the course of this book was how many of these manufactories made no money at all, or were absolutely a drain on the public purse. But still, it was a prestigious thing to have a porcelain manufactory. And so many princes persevered nonetheless, losing money. It was really prestige over profit. Now, what they did do to make profit was start making things like this, things that are ceramics, but thicker, more utilitarian, and much cheaper. And so they pioneered this kind of business practice in which you sell the cheap stuff to the masses, and then you create artistic pieces for advertisement and for the aristocracy at the top. Same thing goes on in our luxury industries today. Gucci, for example, or any of those luxury brands have their runway goods, and then they have their utilitarian, normal person luxury goods. So it's remarkable to see that same pattern.
And you touch upon this very important transition. Well, not even touch. I mean, you explore it in depth of porcelain moving from a shelf displaying to actually objects of use, but most crucially, objects that are found within middle-class household. And you explain that transition takes place actually quite later, and it is only in 30s really that you see porcelain becoming ubiquitous in the middle class households. Can you touch upon the impact porcelain has in that respect?
Certainly. I think one of the things that we still need to know a great deal more about is really middle class consumption in Central Europe. We know a lot about what the courts were doing, but not much about when things trickled down to the rest of the population. And this has been a crucial part of Central European history for a long time, is trying to understand what the middle class was doing and when they really became active forces in politics. But this is another question about when they became really effective in consumption. And I think it's quite late. I think it's delayed by the Napoleonic Wars and all of the trade sanctions and the chaos of those economies as a result, subject about which you know far more than I do. But it's really something that doesn't arrive until rather late, as German consumers in the middle classes don't have a lot of extra disposable income until really you start getting a bit more influx in the 1830s, 40s, and then the big rise is the 1860s and afterwards. And at that point, porcelain becomes part of respectability, something that you need to have when your friends come over to tea, or you need to have for holidays to show your elegance. So this goes down the scale from a kind of princely refinement to a middle class good in that way. But it takes a long time, as you say, a century plus really for that to happen.
And what really surprised me, and I think that's one of the really interesting revelations of your book, is the depth to which the porcelain industry, this porcelain making, really went to in Germany. I think in one point you talk about the fact that by mid-1870s, there were almost 2,000 firms making porcelain in Germany, which is an astounding diversity, right, of companies who I assume were engaged in this feverish kind of competition with each other.
Yes, but they're making porcelain of all different sorts, and some of them are just decorating, some of them actually making it. But by this time, they're also making things like telegraph insulator tubes for the telegraph services, or they're making fittings for gas jets, or they're making doorknobs or porcelain tiles for the bathroom or for public buildings, or they're making various kinds of doll heads, or they're making any other number of things that we now make with plastic were made with porcelain or other ceramics, toast racks. I've seen the most incredible array of strange stuff made out of porcelain. It was
what's your favorite place in that respect?
Oh, wow. It's quite hard to say. I mean, I'd say, you know, the porcelain toast rack is one of my favorites. But there are, of course, endless chamber pots also made of porcelain.
Yeah.
And
you know, I've seen ones, the pots with Napoleon, the pissing pots with Napoleon inside. Not my favorites.
I bet.
But I bet it was popular in Germany.
Oh, I bet. There's a great deal of humor in some of these. You can find all manner of strange, particularly pipes. For example, during the time when men smoked tobacco chiefly in pipes and not cigarettes or cigars, pipes were made in any number of patterns or varieties. And I say some point in the book that there are very few things that I think were never represented on porcelain. I've seen the inside of coal mines. I've seen domestic abuse. I've seen all sorts of both religious and a-religious kinds of depictions. Still, I'm looking for porcelain depicting childbirth. That's one I haven't seen yet.
Interesting.
But almost anything else seems to be viable. So it shows you just how incredibly diverse and crazy this world was, and how much choice there was for consumers who had at least a little bit of disposable money to spend.
I think one of the areas that I've never really pondered and and you flesh it out, was the role of porcelain within the Nazi Germany. And you talk, for example, about a firm that was owned by SS, I believe, that advertised porcelain as the white porcelain being the embodiment of this German Aryan superior race. Would you care to touch upon this subject?
Well, the history of porcelain in the 20th century is one that is really, again, understudied, and there is a tremendous amount we still need to learn about it. It became certainly a utilitarian good during the First World War with respect to replacement for metals. So that was also true in the Nazi period. But the Nazis also found porcelain to be a useful kind of decorative means of conveying their ideology, and used it in a way as Frederick the Great had also used it, that is, to show their taste and refinement and superiority. They were particularly attracted to the whiteness of it because to them it replicated a kind of Berlin classicism that they associated with great periods of German nationalism. And so the combination of the whiteness and the representational qualities made it an ideal medium to create soldier figurines, for example. Also, the Nazis had a great love for certain animals. So there are endless German Alsatians, dogs represented in porcelain, and horses by the barrel, and lots of deer. The sort of hunting fetish of Goering and the like is carried out in porcelain. But these manufacturers, some of them, particularly the one that Himmler set up, mostly catered to making gifts for party members, and were sort of trophy factories more than anything else. At the same time, there were other manufacturers that were working for the Nazis by making munitions or supplies for all of their many ministries, their labor ministry, for example, or their air ministry. So there's a lot of strands that link together the porcelain industry and high politics, and they could be certainly even more fully explored than I had time for in my book.
I think nowadays, not many people really associate Germany with porcelain making. So what happened to this remarkable legacy of German porcelain making? Where is it now in this 21st century?
Well, that's the tragic story that I tell in the very end of this book. The porcelain industry has had lows and highs. It's gone through many different cycles since 1708. And it had another real high and great success in the 1960s when homemakers were very keen on porcelain sets and porcelain dinnerware. And since then, it started to level off, just as our luxury buying habits and our entertaining habits have changed. But after 1989, it really has taken a very big hit. And the economic downturn of 2008 has been even more serious, forcing a lot of companies into bankruptcy. And every day, more of these manufactories close. It's now the case that Meissen, the one last remaining business that has been throughout state-owned, is in terrible debt, more than 20 million euros in debt. And the Saxon state government considers every year whether or not it ought to try to privatize. I don't think they're going to do that. It's too much a part of the heritage of the state, but it's a big drain on the public purse for sure. So it's a big change.
If we decide to travel to Germany, is there a great porcelain collection you can recommend for us to stop and enjoy?
There's almost anywhere you go, there will be porcelain. But I would like to put a real plug in for the two wonderful museums that are part of the so-called Porcelain Econ complex in the far eastern part of Bavaria. One of them is in the town of Hohenberg an der Eger, almost on the Czech border, right up next to the Czech border. And another one is not far away in the town of Zelb. And they're both wonderful introductions both to the manufacturing of porcelain, that's the Selb focus, and then the styles and different types. There's also a fantastic collection of porcelain in Vienna at the Hofburg in the silver cabinet collection. And there are magnificent collections. Sèvres has a museum, actually, for French porcelain just outside of Paris. You can get there on the train. There are collections in Berlin. There are collections in Naples. There are collections in lots of those smaller towns. I've visited many, many different museums where there are porcelain collections. The V&A Museum, Victoria and Albert Museum in London, has a wonderful collection as well. So this is an easy one in terms of, of tourism. There's porcelain almost in every city you want to visit in Europe.
Well, thank you so much for the wonderful book with this sweeping cultural and economic history of porcelain. I really enjoyed you sharing your insight with us. And what's next book project for you?
Well, it is a completely different project, one that I love, but is completely different. It's on the reception of the ancient historian Herodotus from 1700. Just as a teaser, I'll tell you that Herodotus was known, and rightly so, as the father of history and the father of lies. So is,
well, very appropriate nowadays.
A book about truth and fiction and fact checking.
So false news, we should blame Herodotus. Thank you so much, and have a wonderful holiday season.
Thank you, Alex. It's been a pleasure.